My name is Edna Williams, I'm 68 years old, and the woman I thought was my daughter-in-law just served me 3-day-old meatloaf while she fed her own mother filet mignon at my dining room table. What she didn't know was that her family's entire inheritance was sitting in those same leftover containers she thought were good enough for me. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor, and sometimes that humor comes with a 7-figure punchline. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The smell hit me first when I walked into what used to be my kitchen. Stale grease mixed with something that might have been vegetables 3 days ago, all of it sitting under the harsh fluorescent light that Rebecca had insisted on installing. Because it was more practical than the warm pendant lights I'd chosen when I built this house 42 years ago. She was standing at my granite countertop, the one I'd picked out grain by grain, wearing my late husband's favorite apron like it belonged to her, spooning what looked like yesterday's casserole onto a chipped plate that I recognized from the set I'd relegated to the garage sale pile 2 summers ago. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her move around my space with the confidence of ownership, opening my cabinets like she'd memorized every shelf, using my good wooden spoon to scrape the bottom of a container that had clearly seen better days. The kitchen island where Harold and I used to share our morning coffee was covered with her things: vitamin bottles, mail addressed to her at my address, and a stack of real estate magazines that made my stomach turn every time I saw them. "Oh, good, you're back from your walk," she said without turning around, her voice carrying that particular tone that some people use when they're trying to sound pleasant but can't quite hide their irritation. "I made you a plate. It's the leftover shepherd's pie from Monday." I looked at the plate she gestured toward. The food was congealed, separated, and had that dull sheen that comes from being reheated one too many times. Beside it sat a plastic fork, the kind you get with takeout, and a paper napkin that had already absorbed some questionable moisture from the plate. This was what she considered appropriate for me, the woman who had opened her home to her family, who had welcomed her with arms wide enough to embrace not just her but her unemployed brother, her gambling-addicted father, and her mother who hadn't worked a day since the Carter administration. "Where's everyone else eating?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the sounds coming from the dining room. Laughter, the gentle clink of real silverware against real plates, the pop of what sounded like a wine cork. "Oh, we're having a little celebration in the dining room," Rebecca said, finally turning to face me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Marcus got that promotion he was hoping for, and Mom wanted to toast with something special. I thought you might be more comfortable eating in here anyway. You know how you get tired when there's too much commotion." How I get tired. How I get tired in my own home, at my own table, surrounded by people who had moved in piece by piece over the past 18 months until I was the one who felt like a guest. How I get tired of being treated like an inconvenience in the house I'd built with my own hands, metaphorically speaking, working double shifts at the hospital for 37 years to pay for every beam and brick. I picked up the plate and followed the sound of conversation to my dining room, where I found them seated around my mahogany table like they were hosting their own dinner party. Marcus, my son, sat at the head of the table where his father used to sit, raising a glass of what I recognized as the bottle of champagne I'd been saving for a special occasion. Rebecca's mother, Patricia, was cutting into what looked like a perfectly prepared steak, her rings catching the light from my crystal chandelier as she gestured animatedly about something that was making everyone laugh. Rebecca's brother Danny was there too, slouched in my favorite chair with a plate piled high with what appeared to be lobster tail and asparagus. Her father, Frank, was working his way through what looked like a rack of lamb while scrolling through his phone with one hand. The table was set with my good china, the Waterford crystal Harold had given me for our 25th anniversary, and cloth napkins that I recognized as the ones I'd embroidered by hand during the long winter evenings after his funeral. They all looked up when I entered, and for a moment, the conversation stopped. I stood there holding my plate of 3-day-old shepherd's pie, still wearing my walking shoes and the light jacket I hadn't been invited to remove, while they sat in their evening clothes around a table laden with food that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. "Edna," Patricia exclaimed, raising her champagne flute in my direction. "Come join us. We're celebrating Marcus's promotion to regional manager." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised by myself after his father died when he was 12, this boy I'd worked 3 jobs to put through college, who now sat in his father's chair avoiding my eyes while his wife's family treated my home like their personal restaurant. "That's wonderful news," I said, and I meant it. I was proud of Marcus, had always been proud of him. But something about the scene in front of me, something about the casual way they'd arranged themselves in my space while serving me scraps, made me feel like I was watching my life from outside a window. "Sit, sit," Rebecca called from the kitchen, her voice bright with false cheer. "There's a spot right there at the end." The spot she indicated was a small space they'd left between Danny's chair and the wall, barely wide enough for one of the kitchen chairs they'd brought in to accommodate their growing family dinners. No place setting, no wine glass, just a narrow slice of space where I could squeeze in with my leftover dinner and watch them enjoy the feast they'd prepared with my money in my house. I sat down and took a bite of the shepherd's pie. It was cold in the center, salty from sitting too long, and had the texture of something that had been frozen and thawed more than once. Around me, the conversation resumed as if I weren't there. Patricia was telling a story about her hairdresser, Danny was complaining about his job search, and Frank was showing Marcus something on his phone that was making them both chuckle. Rebecca emerged from the kitchen with a fresh bottle of wine and began refilling everyone's glasses, including her own. When she reached my spot at the table, she paused and looked down at my plate. "How is it?" she asked, and I could hear something in her voice that might have been genuine concern or might have been the kind of performative care people display when they want others to see how thoughtful they are. "It's fine," I said, because what else was I supposed to say? That it tasted like cardboard? That I'd been eating leftovers for weeks while they enjoyed fresh meals? That I was tired of being treated like a charity case in my own home? "Good," she said, moving on to pour wine for her brother. "I'm trying to be more mindful about food waste. It's better for the environment when we use everything up." Better for the environment. I watched her pour Danny a generous glass of wine. That probably cost more than the shepherd's pie ingredients. Watched her mother cut another piece of steak that was so perfectly prepared it practically melted under her knife, and I realized that Rebecca's environmental consciousness seemed to extend only to my plate. Marcus caught my eye for a moment and gave me a small smile, the kind he'd given me as a child when he knew he was in trouble but hoped his charm might soften the blow. I smiled back, because that's what mothers do, but inside I felt something shifting, like a foundation settling in a way that changes the whole structure of a house. After dinner, they moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, some elaborate chocolate cake that Rebecca had apparently picked up from the expensive bakery downtown. I began clearing the table, stacking plates and gathering silverware while they settled into my furniture with the casual ownership of people who'd forgotten they were guests. "Oh, just leave that," Rebecca called from the couch where she was curled up next to Marcus with a cup of coffee in my favorite mug. "I'll get to it later." But I knew she wouldn't. I'd been cleaning up after their family dinners for months now, finding wine-stained glasses on my end tables, crumbs ground into my carpet, and dishes soaking in my sink until the food had hardened into something that required industrial-strength scrubbing to remove. So I continued stacking plates, carrying them to the kitchen in small loads because my arthritis makes it hard to carry too much at once. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As I scraped the remains of their feast into the garbage disposal, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd overheard the week before, when Rebecca was on the phone with someone discussing my situation. She'd been standing in my kitchen, using my phone because the reception was better there, talking about how it was really taking a toll on their marriage to have me around all the time. How I was getting more demanding, and how she didn't know how much longer they could manage the arrangement. The arrangement. As if my presence in my own home was some kind of temporary inconvenience they were graciously tolerating rather than the reality that they'd moved into my house, eaten my food, and used my resources while treating me like an unwelcome houseguest. Who'd overstayed her welcome? I finished loading the dishwasher and wiped down the counters, listening to the laughter coming from the living room. Someone had turned on music, something contemporary that I didn't recognize, and I could hear Patricia telling another story that was apparently hilarious based on the response it was getting. When I finally joined them in the living room, they were looking through photo albums on Rebecca's phone, sharing memories of vacations and family gatherings that had taken place before Marcus and I had become part of their extended family unit. I sat in the only remaining chair, a stiff-backed antique that I'd inherited from my mother, and watched them bond over shared experiences that didn't include me. "Remember that Christmas when Danny got so drunk he fell asleep in the hot tub?" Patricia was saying, and everyone erupted in laughter except me, because I hadn't been there. I'd been here, in this house, preparing Christmas dinner for a family that had apparently been having more fun somewhere else. Marcus looked up from the phone and seemed to notice me for the first time since I'd sat down. "Mom, you look tired," he said, his voice gentle but dismissive. "Why don't you head to bed? We'll keep it down." I looked at the clock on the mantel, the antique timepiece that had belonged to Harold's grandmother. It was 8:30 on a Saturday evening, the time when Harold and I used to settle in for our favorite television programs, when we'd share a bowl of popcorn and debate the plot twists of whatever mystery we were watching. Now I was being sent to bed like a child who'd stayed up past her bedtime. "I think I will," I said, standing up slowly and feeling every one of my 68 years in my joints. Good night, everyone. There was a chorus of casual goodnights, the kind of distracted farewells people give when they're eager to get back to their conversation. Marcus stood up and gave me a quick hug, the kind that felt more like obligation than affection, and Rebecca smiled at me from the couch without moving. I walked upstairs to my bedroom, the one I'd shared with Harold for 35 years, and sat on the edge of the bed I'd made that morning. Below me, I could hear them settling back into their evening, their voices mixing with the music in a soundtrack of family happiness that somehow didn't include the person who was paying for it all. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of a sudden clarity that came with finally understanding my place in this particular family dynamic. I was the provider, the resource, the convenient solution to their financial problems, but I was not the beneficiary of the life I was funding. I walked to my dresser and opened the bottom drawer, pushing aside the photo albums and keepsake boxes. Until I found the manila envelope I'd placed there 6 months earlier. Inside were the documents my lawyer had prepared at my request, the ones I'd asked him to draft after the third time I'd found Rebecca going through my financial papers, just to help organize things. The will was straightforward, leaving everything to Marcus as I'd always planned. But the codicil, the addition I'd made after months of watching my generosity be taken for granted, that was something else entirely. It specified that if Marcus was married at the time of my death, his inheritance would be held in trust, with Rebecca and her family having access only to the leftover portions after all other beneficiaries had been satisfied. The other beneficiaries, according to the new documents, were the local food bank, the hospital where I'd worked for nearly 4 decades, and a scholarship fund for nursing students. The leftover portion, after those substantial donations, would amount to roughly the same value as the meals Rebecca had been serving me, scraps, essentially, with just enough substance to sustain life but not enough to satisfy. I'd spent months watching her serve me the dregs while she and her family feasted, months being relegated to the leftovers of my own life while they enjoyed the main course. The irony wasn't lost on me that her family's entire inheritance now depended on those same leftovers, literally and figuratively. I placed the envelope back in the drawer and changed into my nightgown, listening to the sounds of my house being enjoyed by people who'd forgotten that their comfort came at my expense. Tomorrow, I decided, I would call my lawyer and make sure the documents were properly filed and witnessed. Tonight, I would go to sleep in my own bed, in my own house, knowing that justice sometimes comes with a sense of humor that even a 68-year-old woman can appreciate. The laughter from downstairs continued until well past midnight, but for the first time in months, it didn't keep me awake. Instead, I fell asleep thinking about the conversation Rebecca would have with her family when they finally understood that their inheritance, like their dinners, would be made up entirely of whatever was left over after everyone else had been properly fed. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply giving people exactly what they've been giving you, measured out in precisely the same portions they deemed appropriate. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the universe provides the perfect metaphor to make sure they never forget the lesson. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Rebecca rummaging through my kitchen cabinets, opening and closing doors with the kind of frustrated energy that suggested she was looking for something specific and not finding it. I checked the clock. 6:15 in the morning, far earlier than anyone in her family typically rose on a Sunday. I put on my robe and slippers and made my way downstairs, finding her standing in front of my open refrigerator with her hands on her hips, staring at the contents like they had personally offended her. "Is everything all right, dear?" I asked, and she jumped like I'd startled her. "Oh, hi Edna," she said, her voice carrying that particular strain that comes with being caught doing something you're not sure you should be doing. "I was just looking for the coffee creamer. I thought we had some left." I looked past her into the refrigerator and saw that it was nearly empty except for a few condiments, some wilted lettuce, and the container of leftover shepherd's pie that apparently no one else wanted to eat. The expensive groceries from yesterday's dinner, the ones that had funded their celebration, were nowhere to be seen. "I think Danny took the last of it for his coffee last night," I said, though I suspected that wasn't the real reason for her early morning kitchen raid. "There's powdered creamer in the pantry if you'd like." She sighed and closed the refrigerator door with more force than necessary. "It's fine." I was also wondering. She paused, and I could see her weighing her words carefully. "I was wondering if you'd had a chance to think about what we discussed last month. About the house." The house? The conversation she was referring to had taken place on a particularly difficult evening when I'd complained about the noise level during one of their impromptu dinner parties. Rebecca had suggested, in her sweetest voice, that perhaps it was time for me to consider downsizing to something more manageable for someone my age. "A nice senior community," she'd said, "where I could have companionship and activities designed for people in my situation." I've given it some thought, I said carefully, but I'm not ready to make any changes just yet. Her face tightened slightly, the way it did when she was trying to control her frustration. It's just that Marcus and I have been talking, and we think it might be better for everyone if you had your own space. Somewhere smaller, easier to maintain. And this house is really too big for one person. One person. As if she and her family weren't currently occupying 3 of the 4 bedrooms, the basement family room, and most of the common areas. As if I were rattling around in this house alone rather than feeling crowded out of my own living space. I appreciate your concern, I said, but I'm quite comfortable here. She turned away from me and began wiping down counters that were already clean, her movements sharp and efficient. I just think you'd be happier somewhere with people your own age. And Marcus is getting older too, you know. He needs space to grow his career, maybe start a family of his own. Start a family of his own. Marcus was 34 years old and had been married to Rebecca for 3 years. If they wanted to start a family, they'd had plenty of time and space to do it. But apparently, my presence in my own home was somehow preventing them from reproducing. Has Marcus said he feels that way? I asked, because I wanted to hear her try to pin this conversation on my son rather than owning her own agenda. We've discussed it, she said, which wasn't really an answer. We just think it would be better for everyone. Everyone except me, apparently. I was the only one who would be displaced, the only one who would have to give up my home, my memories, my independence. Everyone else would get exactly what they wanted, my house without me in it. I heard footsteps on the stairs in a moment. Later Marcus appeared in the kitchen, already dressed for the day despite the early hour. He kissed Rebecca on the cheek and nodded at me with the distant politeness that had replaced our once close relationship. "Morning, Mom," he said, opening the cabinet where we kept the coffee filters. "You're up early. So is everyone else?" "Apparently," I said, gesturing toward Rebecca, who was now scrubbing my stovetop with unnecessary vigor. "Rebecca was just telling me about your conversation," Marcus said, and I noticed that he didn't meet my eyes when he spoke. "About the house situation. The house situation." As if my reluctance to abandon my home was some kind of problem that needed to be solved rather than a reasonable response to an unreasonable request. "I was explaining to your mother that we think she might be happier in a smaller place," Rebecca said, her voice taking on that particular tone people use when they want to sound patient but are actually quite irritated. "Somewhere with less maintenance, more appropriate for someone her age." "It's not about age," I said quietly, "it's about home." Marcus finally looked at me, and for a moment I saw something that might have been guilt flicker across his face. "Mom, we're just worried about you. This house is a lot of work, and you're not getting any younger." Not getting any younger. I was 68 years old, not 98. I still worked part-time at the hospital, still drove, still managed my own finances and healthcare and social calendar. I was hardly the decrepit invalid they were painting me as. I managed just fine, I said, which was true. What I didn't manage fine was being treated like a guest in my own home, being served leftovers while paying for everyone else's fresh meals, being made to feel like my presence was an inconvenience rather than the foundation that made their comfortable life possible. "Maybe we could look at some places together," Rebecca suggested, her voice brightening with false enthusiasm. "Just to see what's available. There are some really nice communities around here, places where you could have your own space but also have help when you need it. Help when I need it." The only help I needed was to be treated with basic respect in my own home, but apparently that was too much to ask for. "I'll think about it," I said, because I didn't want to have this conversation anymore and I knew that was the only response that would end it. Rebecca smiled, the kind of victorious smile that told me she thought she'd won something. "Great. I'll do some research and we can start making appointments next week." I watched her move around my kitchen with renewed energy, humming softly as she prepared what looked like a proper breakfast for her family while I stood there in my robe, feeling like I'd just been evicted from my own life. That afternoon, while Rebecca and her family were out shopping for God knows what with God knows whose money, I called my lawyer. Richard Henley had been handling my legal affairs since Harold died, and he'd become something of a friend over the years. He was one of the few people who understood the complexities of my situation without judgment. "Edna," he said when his secretary put me through, "how are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Richard, but I need to make some changes to my estate planning. Can you see me this week?" There was a pause, and I could hear the concern in his voice when he replied. "Of course. Is everything all right?" "Everything is exactly as it should be," I said, "but I want to make sure it stays that way." We made an appointment for Tuesday afternoon, and I spent the rest of the weekend observing my household with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a particularly fascinating culture. I watched Rebecca plan menus using my grocery budget while serving me whatever was cheapest or closest to expiring. I watched her family settle into my furniture like they owned it, leaving their personal belongings scattered throughout my house. With the casual disregard of people who'd forgotten they were guests. I watched Marcus navigate between his wife's agenda and his mother's comfort, choosing his wife's agenda every time with the kind of inevitability that spoke to conversations I wasn't part of and decisions that had been made without my input. And I watched myself, or rather, I watched the person I'd become in this environment, accommodating, peripheral, grateful for scraps in my own home. I didn't like what I saw, and I didn't intend to keep seeing it much longer. On Tuesday, I met with Richard in his downtown office, a comfortable space filled with law books and family photos that reminded me of the life I'd had before Rebecca decided I needed to be managed rather than respected. "Tell me what's on your mind," he said after we'd exchanged pleasantries and settled into the chairs by his window. I explained the situation as objectively as I could, the gradual takeover of my home, the financial arrangements that benefited everyone but me, the pressure to relocate so that my son and his wife could have what they wanted without the inconvenience of my presence. Richard listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on the legal pad in front of him. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Edna," he said finally, "what do you want to accomplish with these changes?" "I want to make sure that if something happens to me, the people who inherit my estate understand the value of what they're receiving. I want them to appreciate it the way I would have appreciated being appreciated." He nodded slowly. "And the current beneficiaries?" "Marcus is still the primary beneficiary," I said, "but I want to add some conditions. Some perspective, you might say." Over the next hour, we worked out the details of what would become my final gift to my family, a lesson in proportionality, served with the same care and attention they'd been showing me. The new will would leave the bulk of my estate to charitable causes that mattered to me, with the remainder going to Marcus and Rebecca in the same proportion that my leftover meals had compared to their fresh dinners. "Are you sure about this?" Richard asked as we reviewed the documents. "I'm absolutely certain," I said. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That evening, I returned home to find Rebecca in my kitchen again, this time preparing what looked like another elaborate dinner for her family. The ingredients spread across my counter represented more money than I typically spent on food in a month, but I was apparently not included in this particular meal planning session. "Oh good, you're back," she said without looking up from the expensive cut of meat she was seasoning. "I made you a plate. It's in the refrigerator." I opened the refrigerator and found a small container with what appeared to be leftover soup from several days ago, the kind that forms a skin on top when it sits too long. Beside it was a small bag with 2 dinner rolls that had clearly seen better days. I looked at the bounty spread across my counter, then at the sad little container that represented my share of the meal, and I felt something click into place inside my chest. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of crystalline clarity that made everything suddenly make perfect sense. "Thank you," I said, taking the container and heating it in the microwave while she continued preparing their feast. "This looks lovely." She glanced over at me with surprise, apparently expecting some kind of complaint or resistance. "I'm glad you approve. I'm trying to be more creative with the leftovers." Creative with the leftovers. I ate my reheated soup, while she and her family enjoyed what looked like a restaurant-quality meal in my dining room, and I thought about creativity, about leftovers, about the kinds of surprises that come to people who mistake generosity for weakness and kindness for stupidity. After dinner, I excused myself early again, claiming fatigue that was only partially manufactured. In my bedroom, I placed the new will in my dresser drawer next to the old one, and I felt the kind of peace that comes with knowing you've finally found the perfect solution to a problem that seemed impossible to solve. Downstairs, I could hear them settling into their evening routine in my living room, using my furniture and my resources to build their comfort while treating me like an inconvenience they were graciously tolerating. Tomorrow, Rebecca would probably bring up the house conversation again, and I would probably agree to look at some senior communities, because I'd learned that sometimes the best way forward is to let people think they're getting what they want. But tonight, I fell asleep thinking about justice, about proportionality, about the poetic beauty of giving people exactly what they deserve in exactly the measure they've shown they value it. And I smiled, because sometimes the best revenge is simply ensuring that people receive the same quality of care they've been providing, served with the same attention to detail and the same generous spirit they've been demonstrating. The universe, I've learned, has a sense of humor. And sometimes, if you wait long enough and pay attention to the details, it provides the perfect punchline to a joke that writes itself. 3 months passed before Rebecca made her move, and when she did, it came wrapped in the kind of concerned kindness that makes you question your own instincts. I was sitting in my garden on a Thursday morning, deadheading the roses that Harold had planted for our 10th anniversary, when I heard her heels clicking across the patio stones behind me. "Edna, we need to talk," she said, her voice carrying That particular gravity people use when they're about to deliver news they think you won't like but that they're convinced is for your own good. I looked up from my roses, noting that she was dressed more formally than usual, wearing the navy blue suit she typically reserved for important meetings and the pearl earrings I'd given her for her birthday last year. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and she carried herself with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested this conversation had been planned and rehearsed. "Of course, dear," I said, setting down my gardening shears and brushing the dirt from my gloves. "What's on your mind?" She pulled one of the patio chairs closer to where I was kneeling and sat down with the careful precision of someone who doesn't want to wrinkle her outfit. "Marcus and I have been doing a lot of thinking lately, and we've come to a decision that we think will be best for everyone." Best for everyone. I'd learned to be wary of that phrase, especially when it came from Rebecca, because in my experience it usually meant best for Rebecca while being presented as a universal good. "We found the perfect place for you," she continued, her voice warming with what sounded like genuine enthusiasm. "It's a beautiful senior community about 20 minutes from here, with all the amenities you could want. Professional landscaping. So you wouldn't have to worry about the garden anymore, housekeeping services, meal plans, even transportation to appointments." I continued deadheading roses while she spoke, my hands working automatically while my mind processed what she was really saying. The perfect place for me was anywhere that wasn't here, anywhere that would free up my house for her family's exclusive use. "It sounds lovely," I said, because I'd learned that agreeing in principle while avoiding commitment was the safest way to navigate these conversations. "When did you have in mind?" "Well, that's the exciting part," she said, leaning forward with the kind of animated energy people display when they think they're delivering wonderful news. "There's an opening available next month. These places have waiting lists, you know, but I've been networking with some of the administrators and I managed to get you moved to the top of the list." Networking with administrators. Moved to the top of the list. She'd been planning this for months, working behind the scenes to arrange my displacement while I'd been living in blissful ignorance of her machinations. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said, though thoughtful wasn't exactly the word I would have chosen. "Calculating, perhaps. Strategic. Self-serving." "I knew you'd be pleased," she said, settling back in her chair with the satisfied air of someone who'd just solved a complicated problem. "And the timing couldn't be better, because Marcus and I have some news of our own." She paused dramatically. The way people do when they want to make sure they have your full attention before delivering what they consider to be momentous information. "We're expecting," she said, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." I looked up from my roses and saw the glow on her face, the unmistakable radiance of a woman who was genuinely happy about her pregnancy. For a moment, I felt a surge of the grandmother-to-be joy that should have been my primary response to this news. My son was going to be a father. I was going to have a grandchild. But underneath that joy was something else, something that tasted like disappointment mixed with recognition. The timing of this announcement, coming immediately after the news about my relocation, wasn't coincidental. This was the final piece of her argument, the emotional leverage that would make it impossible for me to resist her plans. "Congratulations," I said, and I meant it, even though I could see exactly how this conversation was designed to unfold. "That's wonderful news." "Thank you," she said, her smile widening. "We're so excited. And of course, we want the baby to have the best possible environment to grow up in. This house is perfect for a family, with the big backyard and all those bedrooms. Perfect for a family. As if I weren't family, as if my presence in the house I'd built would somehow contaminate the environment she wanted to create for her child. "I can see how that would be important," I said, though what I was really seeing was the complete picture of her plan. The pregnancy gave her the ultimate justification for claiming my house. Who could argue with a mother's desire to provide the best for her unborn child? Who could be so selfish as to stand in the way of a growing family's needs? "I'm so glad you understand," she said, reaching over to squeeze my hand with fingers that felt warm and slightly damp. "I was worried you might be resistant to the idea. But I should have known you'd want what's best for your grandchild." "What's best for your grandchild?" The phrase hung in the air between us like a challenge, daring me to be the kind of grandmother who would put her own comfort ahead of a baby's welfare. It was masterfully done, really. She'd boxed me into a corner using my own love for my unborn grandchild as the walls. "When is the baby due?" I asked, partly because I wanted to know and partly because I needed time to process the implications of everything she'd just told me. "December," she said, her hand still resting on her stomach. "Right before Christmas. Can you imagine? Our first Christmas as a family of 3, here in this house with all its holiday traditions." Christmas in this house. The house where Harold and I had celebrated 35 Christmases together, where Marcus had opened his presents every year until he went away to college, where I'd been planning to celebrate my first Christmas as a grandmother. But apparently, that celebration would be taking place without me, in my house, using my decorations and my traditions, while I spent the holiday in some senior community 20 minutes away. That sounds magical, I said, though the word felt like ash in my mouth. It will be, she agreed. And you'll be so comfortable in your new place, with all the activities and social opportunities. I think you'll make lots of new friends. New friends to replace the life I was giving up, activities to fill the time I would no longer spend in my own home, social opportunities to substitute for the family gatherings I would no longer host. She was painting my exile as a social upgrade, my displacement as a lifestyle enhancement. I'm sure I will, I said, though what I was sure of was that this conversation had been carefully orchestrated to make my agreement seem inevitable and my resistance seem selfish. Over the next hour, she laid out the details of her plan with the thoroughness of someone who'd been thinking about this for months. The senior community had an apartment available on the 3rd floor with a lovely view of their gardens. The moving company she'd researched could handle everything, packing and transporting my belongings so I wouldn't have to worry about the stress of organizing the move myself. She'd even looked into storage facilities for the items that wouldn't fit in my new, smaller space. Everything had been decided except the most important detail, my actual consent to any of it. I'll need some time to think about all this, I said when she finally paused for breath. Her smile flickered slightly, the first sign that she'd expected this conversation to go more smoothly. Of course, she said, though I could hear the strain in her voice. But we should probably decide soon. Like I said, these places don't stay available for long. The implied threat was clear: agree now or lose the opportunity. Don't think too hard or you might miss your chance to be displaced on her timeline rather than your own. I understand, I said, standing up and brushing the dirt from my knees. I'll let you know in a few days. Great, she said, rising as well and smoothing down her skirt. I'm so excited about all the changes coming our way. This is going to be such a wonderful new chapter for everyone. A wonderful new chapter. She walked back toward the house with the confident stride of someone who'd just successfully maneuvered a complicated negotiation, leaving me standing in my garden surrounded by the roses I'd been tending for over 20 years. That evening, Marcus came to find me in my sewing room, where I'd been pretending to work on a quilt while actually staring out the window at the garden where I'd had my conversation with his wife. Mom, he said, settling into the chair across from my sewing table with the uncomfortable posture of someone who'd been sent to have a conversation he didn't really want to have. Rebecca told me about your talk today. She did, I said, not making it a question because it obviously wasn't one. She said you seemed open to the idea of Sunset Manor, he continued, using the name of the senior community his wife had researched so thoroughly. I think it could be really good for you. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised alone after his father died, this person I'd sacrificed for and worried about and loved unconditionally for 34 years. He was avoiding my eyes the way he used to as a teenager when he'd done something he knew was wrong but didn't want to admit it. Do you think I can't take care of myself here? I asked, genuinely curious about his answer. It's not that, he said quickly, though his tone suggested it was at least partially that. It's just that this house is a lot of work, and you're not getting any younger. At Sunset Manor, you'd have help with everything. You could just focus on enjoying yourself. Enjoying myself. As if my current life was some kind of drudgery that I needed to be rescued from, rather than a comfortable existence that was being systematically dismantled by people who wanted what I had. And the baby? I asked, because I wanted to hear him acknowledge the real reason for this sudden concern about my welfare. His face brightened immediately, the way it used to when he was a child and someone mentioned his favorite topic. We're so excited, Mom. We want to give this kid everything, you know? The best possible start in life. And that requires my house? The question hung between us for a moment, and I watched him struggle with how to answer it honestly without sounding like he was pushing me out for his own benefit. It's not about requiring, he said finally. It's about wanting. We want our child to grow up somewhere with space, with a yard, with room to run around. And this house has so many memories, so much family history. We want to continue that tradition. Continue that tradition. The tradition that apparently didn't include the person who'd created most of those memories and all of that family history. I see, I said, though what I saw was my son choosing his wife's desires over his mother's comfort, prioritizing his unborn child's hypothetical needs over my very real attachment to the home I'd built with his father. You'll love Sunset Manor, he said, his voice taking on the enthusiastic tone people use when they're trying to convince themselves as much as the person they're talking to. They have book clubs and exercise classes and organized trips to museums and theaters. You'll be around people your own age, people with similar interests. People my own age, as if my current problem was that I was surrounded by people who were too young for me to relate to, rather than people who treated me like an inconvenience in my own home. It sounds wonderful, I said, because arguing would only make this conversation longer and more painful than it already was. Really? He asked, and I could hear the relief in his voice. Rebecca was worried you might be resistant to change. Resistant to change. Not resistant to being displaced, not resistant to giving up my home for someone else's benefit, just generally resistant to change, as if I were some kind of stubborn old woman who couldn't adapt to new circumstances. I'm not resistant to change, I said carefully. I just want to make sure any changes I make are the right ones for me. Of course, he said, leaning forward with renewed energy. That's why we think Sunset Manor is perfect. It's close enough that we can visit all the time, but far enough away that you'll have your own space and independence. Visit all the time. I wondered how often all the time would turn out to be once the novelty of my relocation wore off and the demands of new parenthood took over their lives. I suspected that 20 minutes might feel much farther than they currently imagined when it came to actually making the trip to see me. I'll think about it, I said, which was becoming my standard response to conversations I didn't want to continue. Don't think too long, he said, standing up and giving me a quick hug that felt more like punctuation than affection. Rebecca said they might not hold the apartment if we don't give them an answer soon. They might not hold the apartment. The pressure was ramping up, the timeline being compressed to prevent me from thinking too carefully about what I was being asked to give up. After he left, I sat in my sewing room until well past midnight, listening to the sounds of my house settling around me. The furnace kicked on with its familiar rumble, the old floorboards creaked in their predictable patterns, and the wind moved through the trees outside my window with the whispered conversations I'd been hearing for over 4 decades. This house knew me. Every room held memories of the life I'd built with Harold, the family we'd raised, the dreams we'd shared and achieved together. The kitchen where we'd drunk our morning coffee, the living room where we'd watched our son take his first steps. The bedroom where Harold had died peacefully in his sleep and where I'd learned to live alone without feeling lonely. Now I was being asked to abandon all of that for the convenience of people who'd moved into my space and decided it suited their purposes better than it suited mine. I was being asked to pretend that a senior community apartment could replace the home I'd built with my own hands and my own choices, that organized activities could substitute for the garden I'd cultivated and the routines I'd established over decades of living. The next morning, I called Richard Henley and asked if I could see him again. More changes to the estate plan, he asked when I explained the reason for my call. Not changes, I said. Clarifications. I want to make sure everything is exactly as I intend it to be. We met that afternoon in his office, and I told him about Rebecca's pregnancy, about the pressure to relocate, about the timeline that was being imposed on my decision-making process. They want you out before the baby comes, he said, and it wasn't a question. They want the house, I corrected. The baby is just the justification that makes it impossible for me to say no without looking like a selfish grandmother. Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying the legal documents spread across his desk. Edna, he said finally, I have to ask. Are you making these estate changes out of anger? No, I said, and I meant it. I'm making them out of clarity. For months, I've been trying to understand why I feel so uncomfortable in my own home, why I feel like a guest in my own life. This conversation with Rebecca helped me understand that I'm not paranoid or oversensitive. I'm simply being managed out of my own existence by people who've decided they can make better use of what I have than I can. And you want your estate plan to reflect that understanding? I want my estate plan to ensure that the people who inherit my assets understand their value the same way I've been taught to understand mine. If my presence in my own home is worth leftover soup and pressure to relocate, then their inheritance should reflect that same level of appreciation. We spent the next 2 hours refining the documents I'd already drafted, adding specific language that would make my intentions crystal clear. The bulk of my estate would go to charities that had actually served me over the years: the hospital where I'd worked, the food bank where I'd volunteered, the scholarship fund that would help other women achieve the independence I was being asked to surrender. Marcus would inherit what was left, which would be roughly equivalent to the value of the leftover meals I'd been receiving, enough to survive on, not enough to live comfortably. Rebecca and her family would receive nothing directly, though they could certainly benefit from whatever Marcus chose to share with them from his modest inheritance. The irony is perfect, Richard said as we reviewed the final documents. They'll inherit the leftovers, just like they've been serving you. It's not about irony, I said. It's about proportion. If they want to treat my contributions to this family as leftovers, then their inheritance should reflect that same level of value. That evening, I made my decision about Sunset Manor. Not the decision Rebecca and Marcus were expecting, but The decision that felt right for someone who'd finally stopped trying to accommodate other people's convenience at the expense of her own dignity. I called Rebecca and asked her to come to the living room for a conversation. She arrived with Marcus close behind, both of them wearing the expectant expressions of people who thought they were about to receive the news they'd been hoping for. "I've given a lot of thought to your suggestion about Sunset Manor," I began, settling into my favorite chair while they took seats on the couch across from me. "And?" Rebecca prompted when I paused to collect my thoughts. "And I've decided that you're absolutely right. It would be better for everyone if I had my own space, somewhere more appropriate for someone my age and situation." Rebecca's face lit up with triumph, and Marcus leaned back against the couch cushions with visible relief. "I'm so glad," Rebecca said. "I know it's a big change, but I really think you'll love it there." "I'm sure I would," I agreed. "But I've decided not to move to Sunset Manor." The confusion on their faces was almost comical. They'd been so focused on the outcome they wanted that they hadn't considered the possibility that I might agree with their reasoning while rejecting their solution. "I don't understand," Marcus said. "If you agree that you need a smaller place, then why not Sunset Manor?" "Because Sunset Manor is your choice for me, not my choice for myself," I said. "If I'm going to relocate, I want to go somewhere I choose, somewhere that reflects my own preferences rather than your convenience." Rebecca's smile was beginning to look strained. "But we researched so many options. Sunset Manor really is the best facility in the area." "I'm sure it is," I said. "But I've decided I'd prefer something with a different atmosphere. Something more like a resort than a senior community." "A resort?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying a note of concern that I suspected had more to do with expense than with my well-being. "I've been looking into extended stay programs in places I've always wanted to visit," I said, which was true. I'd spent the previous evening researching luxury accommodations in cities I'd dreamed of seeing but never had the time or opportunity to explore. "I think it would be exciting to spend some time in different places, maybe find somewhere I'd like to settle permanently." The silence that followed my announcement was heavy with implications. If I left the area entirely, I wouldn't be available for the kind of convenient grandparent duties they'd probably been envisioning. If I chose luxury accommodations over budget-friendly senior communities, I'd be spending money they'd probably been counting as part of their inheritance. "But what about the baby?" Rebecca asked, her voice small and uncertain for the first time since I'd known her. "What about the baby?" I asked in return. "You've made it clear that this house is perfect for a growing family. I'm sure you'll be wonderful parents whether I'm 20 minutes away or 2,000 miles away. But we'll want you to be involved," Marcus said, though his tone suggested he was just realizing that involvement required proximity and that proximity wasn't something he could simply assume I'd provide. "I'll be as involved as you want me to be," I said. "But my level of involvement will depend on how I'm treated as a person, not just as a grandmother. If you want me to be part of this child's life, then you'll need to make sure I feel welcomed as part of this family." Rebecca's face had gone pale, and I could see her mind working through the implications of what I'd just said. She'd orchestrated my departure from my own home, but she hadn't considered the possibility that I might actually leave entirely rather than relocating to a convenient nearby facility where I could still provide babysitting services and emotional support while staying out of their daily lives. "We do want you to be part of the family," she said, though her voice lacked the conviction of her earlier pronouncements. "Then perhaps we should discuss what that actually means," I said. "Because for the past several months, being part of this family has meant eating leftovers while you enjoy fresh meals, being pressured to relocate so you can have my house, and being treated like my presence in my own home is an inconvenience you're graciously tolerating." Marcus started to speak, but I held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not angry," I said, which was true. "I'm simply done accepting treatment that doesn't reflect my value to this family. If you want me to be an involved grandmother, then you need to start treating me like a respected family member. If you prefer to have my house without my presence, then you should understand that my absence will be complete, not just geographically convenient." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd had before. For the first time since Rebecca had joined our family, I spoke honestly about how I'd been feeling, about the gradual erosion of my place in my own home, about the way my contributions had been taken for granted while my comfort had been treated as expendable. Rebecca cried, though whether from guilt or frustration I couldn't tell. Marcus alternated between defensiveness and apologetic concern, trying to minimize the significance of what I was describing while also promising that things would change. But I was past the point where promises could fix what had been broken. Trust, once damaged, requires more than words to repair. It requires sustained behavioral change, demonstrated respect, and a genuine understanding of the harm that had been done. "I'll postpone my relocation plans for now," I said as our conversation wound down. "But I want to be clear that my staying depends on things being different. If they're not, then I'll pursue other options that prioritize my happiness rather than your convenience. That night, I lay in my bed listening to the muffled sounds of Rebecca and Marcus having what appeared to be an intense discussion in their bedroom down the hall. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably strained, the rhythm of voices rising and falling with the cadence of people working through a problem they hadn't anticipated. I wasn't eavesdropping, exactly. I was simply lying in my own bed, in my own house, listening to the sounds of my family grappling with the reality that I wasn't as easily manipulated as they'd assumed. It was strangely comforting, like listening to a radio drama where you know the protagonists are going to have to work much harder for their happy ending than they'd originally planned. The next morning, Rebecca appeared in my kitchen earlier than usual, wearing an apron I recognized as one of my own and standing at the stove preparing what looked like a proper breakfast. Not leftover breakfast, not reheated breakfast, but fresh eggs and bacon and toast that smelled like it had just come out of the toaster. "Good morning," she said when she saw me, her voice carrying a brightness that sounded slightly forced but was nevertheless an improvement over the casual dismissal I'd grown accustomed to. "I thought I'd make breakfast for everyone this morning." Everyone. Including me, apparently, based on the place setting she'd arranged at my usual spot at the kitchen table. Not a paper plate with plastic utensils, but my regular dishes with my regular silverware, positioned the way I preferred them rather than haphazardly slapped down like an afterthought. "That's very thoughtful," I said, settling into my chair and noting that she'd even remembered how I liked my coffee, 1 sugar, splash of cream, served in the mug with the faded flowers that Harold had given me for Mother's Day 20 years ago. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night," she said, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon in front of me with the careful attention of someone who was trying very hard to demonstrate thoughtfulness. "And I realize I haven't been as considerate as I should have been." I took a bite of the eggs, which were cooked exactly the way I liked them, and waited for her to continue. "Marcus and I talked for a long time," she said, settling into the chair across from me with her own plate. "And we both agree that we want you to feel comfortable here. This is your home, and we don't want you to feel like you have to leave your home." The acknowledgement I'd been waiting months to hear, spoken with what sounded like genuine recognition rather than grudging concession. "I appreciate that," I said, because I did, even though I understood that this conversation was motivated more by panic than by genuine remorse. The prospect of me leaving entirely had apparently clarified the difference between having me conveniently nearby and losing access to me altogether. "We want to make some changes," she continued. "Starting with meals. I realize I've been inconsistent about including you in our dinner planning. I'd like to change that." Inconsistent. It was a gentle way of describing the pattern of serving me leftovers while she and her family enjoyed fresh meals, but at least it was an acknowledgement that the pattern existed. "That would be nice," I said. "And the house," she added, her voice becoming slightly hesitant. "We want you to know that we understand this is your space. We don't want you to feel like we're taking over." Too late for that, I thought, but I appreciated the sentiment even if it came after months of evidence to the contrary. Over the next several weeks, things did change. Not dramatically, not completely, but enough to suggest that my conversation with them had been taken seriously. Rebecca began including me in meal planning, asking about my preferences and dietary restrictions the way she would for any family member whose comfort mattered to her. She stopped rearranging my furniture without asking and started consulting me about household decisions that affected my daily routines. Marcus made an effort to spend time with me that wasn't related to their agenda for my relocation. We resumed our old tradition of Sunday afternoon walks, something we'd let slide over the past year as he'd become more absorbed in his wife's family dynamics. Rebecca's family was still very much present in my house, but their presence felt less like an occupation and more like an extended visit. They were more careful about cleaning up after themselves, more respectful of my schedule and my space, more aware that their comfort in my home depended on my continued willingness to share it. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when I felt peripheral to conversations happening in my own living room, still occasions when Rebecca's family dynamics took precedence over my preferences. But it was better, and better was something I could work with. The real test came when Rebecca had her first major pregnancy craving crisis on a Tuesday evening in late summer. She'd been feeling nauseated all day and couldn't keep anything down, except bland crackers and ginger ale. By dinner time, she was tearful and frustrated, insisting that the only thing she could possibly eat was a specific type of soup from a restaurant across town that would close before anyone could get there. In the old dynamic, I would have been expected to figure out a solution while she and her family commiserated about the challenges of pregnancy. Instead, Marcus immediately offered to drive to 3 different grocery stores to find ingredients for homemade soup, while Rebecca's mother called every restaurant in the area looking for something similar that might deliver. I found myself In the unusual position of being consulted rather than conscripted, asked for my opinion rather than assigned a task. "What do you think, Mom?" Marcus asked as we stood in the kitchen considering options. "You always made great soup when I was sick. Do you have any ideas?" It was such a small thing, being asked for my input rather than simply being expected to provide it. But it represented a shift in how I was perceived within the family dynamic, a recognition that my experience and knowledge had value beyond my utility as a problem solver. I ended up teaching Rebecca how to make the chicken and rice soup that had been Harold's favorite remedy for everything from head colds to heartbreak. We worked together in the kitchen, my hands guiding hers as she learned to season the broth and judge when the rice was perfectly tender. It was the first time we'd ever cooked together as partners rather than as primary cook and reluctant assistant, and I found myself remembering what I'd liked about Rebecca when Marcus first brought her home. She was quick to learn, eager to get things right, and genuinely grateful for guidance when it was offered rather than imposed. "This is so much better than restaurant soup," she said as we sat around the table sharing our creation. "I can't believe I never learned to make this." "It's never too late to learn," I said, and I meant it in more ways than one. That night, as I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about second chances and new beginnings. Not the kind that require dramatic gestures or complete transformations, but the kind that come from small adjustments and sustained effort. The kind that acknowledge mistakes without dwelling on them, that focus on moving forward rather than relitigating the past. Rebecca's pregnancy was progressing smoothly, and with it came a gradual shift in how our household operated. Instead of being treated like an obstacle to their family planning, I found myself being included in conversations about the nursery, about baby names, about the kinds of traditions they wanted to establish for their child. I was still planning to update my will, but the urgency had diminished somewhat. Not because I trusted them completely, but because I'd learned that I could speak up for myself when necessary, that I didn't have to accept treatment that diminished my dignity, and that sometimes the best way to get respect is to require it rather than hope for it. The house felt like mine again, shared but not surrendered. My routines were respected, my preferences considered, my contributions valued rather than taken for granted. It wasn't the same as it had been when Harold was alive, but it was something I could live with, something I could even find happiness in. And if things changed again, if the respect I demanded proved to be temporary rather than genuine, well, I had options. I had resources. I had the power to make choices that prioritized my own well-being, and I demonstrated that I was willing to use that power when necessary. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply refusing to accept less than you deserve and being willing to walk away if that's what it takes to maintain your dignity. Sometimes it's teaching people how to treat you by showing them what happens when they don't. The leftover will was still in my dresser drawer, a reminder that justice doesn't always have to be served immediately to be served effectively. But for now, it could wait. For now, I was content to enjoy the fresh meals and genuine respect that came with finally standing up for myself in my own home. The illusion of change lasted exactly 3.5 months. I should have known it was too good to be true, this sudden transformation in how Rebecca treated me, this newfound respect for my place in my own home. People don't fundamentally change their character just because they've been called out on their behavior. They modify their tactics. It started small, as these things always do. A forgotten invitation to a family dinner that Rebecca claimed she thought she'd mentioned to me. A doctor's appointment scheduled during the time I usually spent in my garden, with apologies about how difficult it was to get appointments these days. Little erosions of the consideration I'd fought so hard to establish, each one accompanied by perfectly reasonable explanations that made me question whether I was being oversensitive. The breaking point came on a cold November morning when I walked into my kitchen to find Rebecca standing at my counter, speaking in hushed tones into her phone while Patricia and Danny sat at my table sharing what appeared to be a real estate brochure. "No, I understand the market is competitive," Rebecca was saying, her back turned to me as she gestured with her free hand. "But we're very motivated buyers, and we can close quickly. The current owner is elderly and looking to downsize, so timing shouldn't be an issue." Current owner is elderly and looking to downsize. I stood frozen in my own doorway, listening to my daughter-in-law describe me to what was obviously a real estate agent as if my relocation was already a settled matter, rather than a conversation we'd tabled months ago. Patricia looked up and saw me standing there, her face flushing with the guilty embarrassment of someone caught discussing something they weren't supposed to discuss. She nudged Danny with her elbow and nodded toward me, and they both suddenly became very interested in their coffee cups. Rebecca continued her conversation, oblivious to my presence. "The house has been in the family for decades, so there's definitely some emotional attachment, but I think we can work through that. She knows it's best for everyone involved. She knows it's best for everyone involved." I cleared my throat loudly, and Rebecca spun around with the startled expression of someone caught in the middle of something they knew was inappropriate. "Oh, Edna," she said, covering the phone with her hand. "I didn't hear you come down. I'm just finishing up a call." "So I gathered," I said, walking to my coffee maker and beginning my morning routine with the kind of deliberate calm that comes from being so angry you're afraid of what might happen if you let yourself react honestly. Rebecca wrapped up her call quickly, using the vague language people employ when they want to end a conversation without revealing too much about it to unwanted listeners. When she hung up, she turned to face me with a smile that looked like it had been painted on with considerable effort. "That was just some preliminary research," she said, her voice bright with false casualness. "You know how I like to be prepared for everything." "Research for what, exactly?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Patricia and Danny suddenly discovered urgent reasons to be elsewhere, gathering their coffee cups and the real estate materials with the hurried efficiency of people fleeing an uncomfortable situation. They mumbled polite good mornings in my direction before disappearing into other parts of my house. "Well," Rebecca said, settling into one of my kitchen chairs with the cautious posture of someone preparing to deliver news they know won't be well received. "Marcus and I have been talking, and with the baby coming in just a few weeks, we think it might be time to revisit our conversation about living arrangements." Living arrangements. The euphemism was almost insulting in its transparency. "I thought we'd settled that conversation," I said, pouring my coffee and taking my usual seat across from her. "I thought we'd agreed that I was staying in my home." "We did," she said quickly, "and we want you to know that we respect that decision. But things have changed since then. I'm going to need help with the baby, and Marcus is going to be working longer hours to support our growing family. We just think it would be easier for everyone if we had more space and fewer complications." Complications? That's what? I'd become in my own home, a complication that made their lives more difficult rather than a family member whose comfort and happiness mattered. "What kind of help are you expecting?" I asked, because I wanted to understand exactly what role they'd envisioned for me in this new arrangement. "Oh, you know," she said, waving her hand vaguely as if the details were too obvious to specify. "Babysitting when we need to go out, helping with nighttime feedings, maybe some light housework when I'm too tired to keep up with everything." Babysitting, night feedings, housework. They wanted me to relocate so they could have my house, but they also wanted me to be available to provide childcare and domestic services when convenient. I would be displaced but not dismissed, removed but still accessible for exploitation. "And where exactly would I be providing this help from?" I asked. "Well, that's what I was researching," she said, her voice taking on the enthusiastic tone people use when they're trying to sell something they know the other person doesn't want to buy. "There are several senior communities within 15 minutes of here. Close enough that we could call when we need you, but far enough away that you'd have your own independence." Independence. The word had lost all meaning coming from someone who was describing a scenario in which I would be summoned for domestic duties while being denied the dignity of living in my own home. "I see," I said, though what I saw was crystal clear. The respectful treatment of the past few months had been a performance designed to lull me into complacency until they could present me with a fait accompli. They'd been planning my displacement the entire time, just with more subtlety than their original approach. "I know it's a lot to think about," Rebecca continued, "but I really think this could work out perfectly for everyone. You'd have your own space, we'd have room for our family, and we'd all still be close enough to support each other." Support each other. As if this arrangement involved mutual support rather than me providing services while receiving displacement in return. That afternoon, I called Richard Henley for what I knew would be our final meeting about my estate planning. "They're at it again," I said without preamble when he answered the phone. "The house situation?" "The house situation, the baby situation, the grandmother as unpaid domestic help situation. All of it wrapped up in a nice package of concern for my well-being." We met the next day, and I told him about the phone call I'd overheard, about Rebecca's research into my relocation, about the expectation that I would provide childcare and housework from my conveniently located senior community apartment. "What do you want to do?" he asked when I finished explaining the situation. "I want to finalize everything exactly as we discussed," I said. "And I want to make sure there are no loopholes, no ways for them to contest or delay the execution of my wishes." We spent the afternoon reviewing every detail of the documents we'd prepared months earlier. The charitable donations that would comprise the bulk of my estate, the modest inheritance that would go to Marcus, the specific language that would make it clear that Rebecca and her family were receiving exactly what their treatment of me had earned them. "There's one more thing," I said as we wrapped up our meeting. "I want to add a codicil that explains my reasoning. Not for legal purposes, but for clarity. I want them to understand that this isn't arbitrary or vindictive. It's proportional." Richard looked up from his notes with raised eyebrows. An explanation? A letter, I said. Something that will be read along with the will, something that connects their inheritance to their behavior. I want them to understand the relationship between how they treated me and what they're receiving. We drafted the letter together, carefully worded to avoid any language that could be construed as emotional manipulation or vindictive punishment. Instead, it simply laid out the facts, the pattern of treatment I'd received, the requests for my displacement, the expectation that I would provide services while being denied dignity. The inheritance you are receiving, the letter concluded, reflects the same proportion of care and consideration that you showed me during my lifetime. If you find it insufficient, I encourage you to reflect on whether the treatment you provided me might also have been insufficient. It was perfect in its restraint, devastating in its accuracy. That evening, I returned home to find my house in chaos. Rebecca was in what appeared to be early labor, Marcus was running around trying to gather hospital bags and car keys, and Patricia was on the phone with someone giving dramatic updates about contractions and timing. For a moment, I forgot about our morning conversation, forgot about the real estate research and the relocation pressure. My daughter-in-law was about to give birth to my grandchild, and whatever complicated feelings I had about our relationship, this was a moment that transcended our petty conflicts. How far apart are the contractions? I asked, falling into the calm efficiency that had served me well during 37 years of nursing. About 6 minutes, Marcus said, his voice tight with anxiety. We probably should have left for the hospital an hour ago, but Rebecca insisted she wasn't ready. I looked at Rebecca, who was breathing through what was obviously a strong contraction while gripping the back of my kitchen chair. Her face was flushed, her hair damp with perspiration, and her eyes had the distant focus of someone dealing with intense physical sensations. Let's get you to the hospital, I said, taking charge of the situation with the authority that comes from professional experience. Marcus, you drive. Patricia, you gather the bags. I'll help Rebecca to the car. You're coming with us? Rebecca asked between breaths, her voice carrying a note of surprise that might have been hope. Of course I'm coming, I said, because whatever our disagreements, I wasn't going to miss the birth of my grandchild. The next 12 hours were a blur of hospital corridors, waiting room coffee, and the peculiar intimacy that comes from sharing a major life event with people you're in conflict with. Marcus paced the halls like an expectant father from a 1950s movie. Patricia provided running commentary on every aspect of Rebecca's labor based on her own experiences 30 years earlier, and I found myself falling back into the professional calm that had always been my strength in medical situations. Rebecca's labor was long and difficult, complicated by the baby's position and her own exhaustion. There were moments when the medical team's concern was palpable, when Marcus's anxiety reached near panic levels, and when I found myself holding Rebecca's hand while she cried through contractions that seemed to go on forever. I can't do this. She sobbed during a particularly intense moment in the early hours of the morning. I'm not strong enough. Yes, you are, I said, squeezing her hand with the conviction of someone who'd seen hundreds of women discover strength they didn't know they possessed. You're stronger than you think, and you're almost there. When my granddaughter finally arrived at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in December, she was perfect. 7 pounds, 3 ounces of wrinkled, red-faced perfection with Marcus's nose and Rebecca's stubborn chin. They named her Emma Grace, and when the nurse placed her in my arms for the first time, I felt something inside my chest crack open with pure, uncomplicated love. She's beautiful, I whispered, studying her tiny fingers and the way her eyes moved beneath her closed lids. She's absolutely perfect. For those first few hours after Emma's birth, our family conflicts seemed to dissolve in the face of this new miracle. We were just grandparents and parents, marveling at this tiny person who had changed everything simply by existing. Rebecca was exhausted but radiant, Marcus was tearful with pride and relief, and I was completely besotted with my granddaughter. But reality has a way of reasserting itself, and by the time we brought Emma home 3 days later, the old tensions had begun to resurface. I've been thinking, Rebecca said as I helped her settle into the rocking chair in what had been my guest room but was now the nursery. It would be so helpful to have you closer during these first few weeks. Maybe you could reconsider the Sunset Manor idea, just temporarily, until we get into a routine with Emma. Temporarily. Just until they got into a routine. Except that temporary arrangements have a way of becoming permanent, especially when they serve other people's convenience. I think I can help plenty from right here, I said, adjusting Emma's blanket as she slept in Rebecca's arms. But if you were at Sunset Manor, you could come over during the day to help, and then you'd have your own space to rest in the evenings. It would be less disruptive for everyone. Less disruptive for everyone. Translation, you could provide the services we need without interfering with our privacy or taking up space we'd rather use for ourselves. Over the next 2 weeks, as I helped with nighttime feedings and endless loads of baby laundry, the pressure to relocate intensified. It came disguised as concern for my sleep schedule, worry about my energy levels, suggestions that I deserved my own peaceful space after doing so much to help them adjust to parenthood. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being asked to leave precisely because I was so helpful, because my presence made their lives easier in ways they wanted to access without having to acknowledge or reciprocate. "Mom," Marcus said one evening as we sat in the living room, while Rebecca napped and Emma slept in her bassinet between us. "I want you to know how much we appreciate everything you're doing for us." "I love helping," I said, which was true. Taking care of Emma, watching her grow and change daily, teaching Rebecca the practical skills of new motherhood, it all felt meaningful in a way that other activities in my life had not. "That's what makes this so hard," he continued, and I could tell from his tone that this conversation had been planned and rehearsed. "We feel guilty taking so much of your time and energy when you should be enjoying your retirement." Enjoying my retirement. As if helping with my granddaughter was some kind of burden I was shouldering rather than a joy I was experiencing. "Rebecca and I have been talking," he continued, "and we really think you'd be happier with your own space. Somewhere you could rest properly, have your own schedule, not feel obligated to help us all the time." Not feel obligated to help. The ultimate manipulation, framing my displacement as liberation from duties I actually wanted to perform. "What if I like feeling obligated to help?" I asked. "What if taking care of Emma is the most meaningful thing I've done in years?" Marcus looked uncomfortable, the way people do when confronted with responses that don't fit their script. "Of course we want you to be involved," he said. "We just think you'd be more comfortable with some distance. Some separation between helping and living." Some separation between helping and living. They wanted to compartmentalize me, to access my services while maintaining control over my presence in their daily lives. That night, I made my final decision about my estate. Not in anger, not in hurt, but in the clear-eyed recognition that some people will never see you as anything more than a resource to be managed for their convenience. I called Richard Henley the next morning and told him to proceed with filing all the documents we'd prepared. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said. "And I want to add one more instruction. When the will is read, I want that letter read aloud, not just distributed silently. I want them to hear the connection between their choices and their consequences." 2 days later, I had what would turn out to be my last conversation with Rebecca. About living arrangements. "I've found the perfect place," she announced as she entered my kitchen where I was preparing bottles for Emma's evening feeding. "It's a lovely apartment at Sunset Manor, and they've had a cancellation. It's available immediately." Available immediately. The timing was suspiciously convenient, given that we were in the heart of the holiday season when most senior communities had waiting lists. "I see," I said, continuing to prepare the bottles with steady hands while my mind processed the implications of what she was telling me. "I know it's short notice," she continued, "but these opportunities don't come along often. I really think you should take a look at it before someone else grabs it." Before someone else grabs it. The manufactured urgency was almost insulting in its transparency. "And when would you like me to look at it?" I asked. "Well, I made an appointment for tomorrow afternoon," she said, her voice carrying the bright enthusiasm of someone who thought they were delivering good news. "I thought we could go together, maybe have lunch afterward to celebrate your new independence." Celebrate my new independence. The final insult wrapped in festive language. "I appreciate the thought," I said, placing the prepared bottles in the refrigerator and turning to face her fully. "But I won't be needing to look at apartments. I've decided to stay exactly where I am." Her smile faltered slightly. "But we discussed this. We agreed that it would be better for everyone if you had your own space." "You discussed it," I corrected. "You decided it." I never agreed to anything except to think about it, and I've thought about it extensively. My conclusion is that I'm perfectly happy in my own home. "But Emma needs space to grow," she said, her voice taking on the desperate edge of someone whose carefully laid plans were being disrupted. "And we need privacy as a new family. Surely you can understand that." "I understand that you want my house without me in it," I said calmly. "I understand that you'd like me to be available to provide childcare and domestic services while living somewhere else for your convenience. What I don't understand is why you think that arrangement would be acceptable to me." Rebecca's face flushed red. "That's not fair. We've been nothing but considerate of your needs. Have you?" I asked. "Because from where I sit, it seems like you've been very considerate of your own needs while expecting me to be grateful for whatever scraps of consideration you occasionally threw my way." The conversation deteriorated from there, with Rebecca becoming increasingly agitated as she realized that her timeline for my relocation wasn't going to be met, and me becoming increasingly resolved in my decision to stop accommodating other people's convenience at the expense of my own dignity. "Fine," she said finally, gathering up her purse and phone with sharp, angry movements. "But don't expect us to tiptoe around your schedule anymore. If you want to stay here, then you'll have to accept that this is our home now too, and we're going to live our lives the way we want to live them. Our home now too." The mask had finally slipped completely, revealing what I'd suspected all along. They didn't see this as my house that they were sharing, but as their house that I was cluttering up with my inconvenient presence. After she left, I sat in my kitchen holding Emma while she slept, studying her tiny face and thinking about the legacy I wanted to leave her. Not just financial, but moral. What kind of lesson would I be teaching her about dignity and self-respect if I allowed myself to be pushed around by people who valued my resources more than my person? What kind of grandmother would I be if I modeled accommodation and submission rather than strength and self-advocacy? That evening, I called my lawyer one more time. "I want to add a trust fund for Emma," I said. "Something separate from the main estate, something that will be available to her when she turns 18 regardless of what happens with the rest of the inheritance." "What kind of amount are we talking about?" Richard asked. "Enough to pay for college, to give her real choices about her future. I want her to have options that don't depend on her parents' financial decisions." We worked out the details over the phone, establishing a substantial trust that would ensure Emma's education and early independence regardless of how her parents managed their own inheritance. It felt like the right thing to do, the kind of gift that would honor my love for her while also providing a lesson about the difference between conditional and unconditional support. The trust would be managed by the same bank that handled my other financial affairs, with strict instructions that Emma's parents would have no access to the funds until she reached the age of majority. It was my way of ensuring that at least one person in this family would receive the kind of support that came without strings attached, without expectations of gratitude or reciprocal services. That night, I sat in my living room with Emma sleeping in my arms while Marcus and Rebecca had what sounded like an intense discussion in their bedroom. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably frustrated, the rhythm of voices belonging to people whose plans had been disrupted and who were trying to figure out their next move. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was simply sitting in my own living room, in my own house, holding my granddaughter and listening to the sounds of my family grappling with the reality that I wasn't going to be as easily managed as they'd assumed. It was strangely peaceful, like listening to a radio drama where you already know how the story ends but you're curious to see how the characters will react when they finally understand the plot they've been acting out without realizing it. The snow began falling that night, thick flakes that covered my garden and made the whole world look clean and new. I sat by the window with Emma, pointing out the falling snow and telling her about the winters her grandfather and I had shared in this house, about the snowmen we'd built with her father when he was young, about the Christmas mornings that had filled these rooms with laughter and love. She was too young to understand my words, but she seemed to listen anyway, her dark eyes watching my face with the kind of intense attention that newborns give to the people who matter most to them. "Your parents love you very much," I whispered to her as the snow continued to fall. "And so do I. More than you'll ever know. But sometimes the people who love you make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes have consequences that last much longer than they intended." I was thinking about the will in my dresser drawer, about the letter that would explain my choices, about the trust fund that would ensure Emma's future regardless of her parents' financial wisdom. I was thinking about justice and proportionality, about the difference between revenge and natural consequences. But mostly I was thinking about love, about the difference between love that seeks to control and love that seeks to liberate, about the kind of grandmother I wanted to be for this precious child who deserved so much better than the family dynamics she'd been born into. The snow fell all night, transforming my familiar garden into something magical and new. In the morning, I would wake up in my own bed, in my own house, knowing that I'd made the right choices for the right reasons. I would continue to love my family, continue to help with Emma, continue to live my life with dignity and purpose. And someday, when Emma was old enough to understand, I would tell her about the importance of standing up for yourself, about the difference between generosity and exploitation, about the kind of strength that comes from knowing your own worth and refusing to accept less than you deserve. The will was final, the trust was established, and the letter was ready to be read. Justice would be served, proportional and precise, measured out in exactly the same portions as the respect I'd been shown. Sometimes the best revenge is simply giving people exactly what they've earned, served with the same care and attention they've demonstrated in return. The heart attack came on a Tuesday morning in February, exactly 2 months after Emma's birth. I was in my garden despite the cold, checking on the early crocuses that had begun pushing through the last patches of snow, when I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that I'd been ignoring for weeks. At first, I told myself it was just The cold air affecting my breathing, or perhaps the stress of the ongoing tension in my household. Rebecca had been escalating her campaign to relocate me with the desperate energy of someone whose carefully laid plans were being thwarted, and the atmosphere in my house had become increasingly strained as a result. But when the pain shot down my left arm with the unmistakable intensity that 37 years of nursing had taught me to recognize, I knew exactly what was happening. I made it as far as my kitchen before I had to sit down, fumbling for my phone with hands that suddenly felt disconnected from my body. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus found me collapsed at my kitchen table, the same table where Rebecca had served me countless leftover meals while she and her family enjoyed fresh food prepared with my money. He'd come downstairs to get Emma's morning bottle and found me slumped forward with my head resting on my arms, conscious but unable to move. "Mom," he said, his voice sharp with panic. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Heart attack," I managed to whisper, though speaking felt like trying to breathe underwater. "Call ambulance." The next few hours were a blur of sirens and hospital corridors, emergency room chaos and the controlled urgency of medical professionals doing what they did best. I drifted in and out of consciousness during the worst of it, aware of Marcus's voice in the background providing medical history to doctors, Rebecca's worried phone calls to family members, the steady beeping of machines monitoring my vital signs. When I finally woke up fully, I was in a cardiac care unit with tubes and wires attached to various parts of my body. Marcus was asleep in a chair beside my bed, looking younger and more vulnerable than he had in years. Rebecca was nowhere to be seen, though I could hear Emma crying somewhere in the distance, which meant they were both somewhere in the hospital. "How long have I been here?" I asked when Marcus stirred and opened his eyes. 2 days, he said, sitting up and reaching for my hand with the careful gentleness of someone who'd been genuinely frightened. "The doctors say you're going to be okay, but it was touch and go for a while." Touch and go? I processed this information with the clinical detachment that comes from years of medical training. I'd had a significant cardiac event, survived it, but the experience had undoubtedly changed something fundamental about my physical limitations and life expectancy. "Where's Rebecca?" I asked. "She's in the family lounge with Emma," Marcus said. "She's been here the whole time, barely sleeping. We've all been worried sick." Worried sick. I wondered if their worry was about my health or about the implications of my potential death for their living situation. It was an uncharitable thought, but recent events had taught me to question the motivations behind other people's expressed concern for my well-being. Over the next few days, as I gradually regained my strength and the doctors ran tests to assess the damage to my heart, I had plenty of time to think about mortality and legacy, about the choices I'd made and the consequences that would follow. My death. The will was complete, safely filed with Richard Henley and properly witnessed according to all legal requirements. The trust fund for Emma was established and funded, ensuring her future education regardless of how her parents managed their own inheritance. The letter explaining my reasoning was ready to be read alongside the will, connecting their inheritance to their treatment of me during my lifetime. I felt a strange sense of peace about all of it, not because I was ready to die, but because I was prepared for death in a way that left no loose ends or unfinished business. Rebecca appeared in my hospital room on the 3rd day, carrying Emma in her arms and wearing the kind of exhausted expression that comes from days of sustained worry. She looked genuinely distressed, with dark circles under her eyes and the slightly wild appearance of someone who'd been operating on coffee and adrenaline for too long. "How are you feeling?" she asked, settling into the chair Marcus had vacated. When he went to get coffee. "Better," I said, which was true. The chest pain had subsided, my breathing was easier, and the doctors seemed cautiously optimistic about my recovery. "I've been thinking," she said, shifting Emma to her other arm and avoiding my eyes. "About everything that's happened between us. About the things I've said and done." I waited for her to continue, curious about where this conversation was headed. "I want you to know that I never meant to make you feel unwelcome in your own home," she said, her voice carrying what sounded like genuine regret. "I know I've been pushy about the living situation, and I realize now that it probably seemed like I was trying to get rid of you. Probably seemed like." Even in her apology, she couldn't quite bring herself to acknowledge the reality of what her behavior had actually been. "I appreciate that," I said, because I did appreciate the effort, even if I wasn't entirely convinced of its sincerity. "The thing is," she continued, "I've been so focused on what I thought was best for everyone that I didn't really consider what you wanted. And that wasn't fair." What I wanted. It was the first time I could remember her acknowledging that my own preferences might be relevant to decisions about my life. "What made you realize that?" I asked, genuinely curious about her sudden shift in perspective. She was quiet for a long moment, looking down at Emma who was sleeping peacefully despite the hospital environment. "When Marcus called to tell me You'd had a heart attack, she said finally. My first thought wasn't about the house or living arrangements or any of that. It was about Emma growing up without her grandmother. Emma growing up without her grandmother. The first acknowledgement that my value to the family extended beyond my real estate and financial resources. I don't want that, she continued. I don't want Emma to miss out on having you in her life because I was too stubborn to appreciate what we had. It was a pretty speech, delivered with what appeared to be genuine emotion. But I'd learned to be wary of Rebecca's speeches, especially when they came at moments when she wanted something from me. What are you saying, exactly? I asked. I'm saying that I want you to come home, she said, meeting my eyes for the first time since she'd entered the room. I want you to stay in your house, and I want us to figure out how to be a real family instead of just people who happen to live in the same place. A real family. The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with implications and possibilities that both appealed to me and made me cautious. That sounds wonderful, I said carefully, but I need to understand what that means in practical terms. What would be different? Everything, she said with the fervor of someone who'd had a genuine epiphany. We'd include you in all our decisions about Emma. We'd ask your opinion about household matters instead of just telling you what we've decided. We'd treat your home like your home instead of acting like we own the place. We'd treat your home like your home. The fact that this needed to be stated as a new policy rather than an obvious given spoke volumes about how far our relationship had deteriorated. And what about your family? I asked. Patricia and Danny and Frank? Rebecca's face tightened slightly, and I could see her struggling with how to address this issue. They'll still visit, she said, but not like before. They can't just move in and take over your space the way they have been. Move in and take over. Another acknowledgement of behavior that had been obvious to everyone except, apparently, the people engaging in it. Over the next week, as I recovered in the hospital, and then at home, Rebecca seemed genuinely committed to the changes she'd promised. She consulted me about Emma's feeding schedule, asked my opinion about baby gear purchases, and made an effort to include me in conversations about their future plans. Her family's presence in my house became much less intrusive. Patricia still visited, but she stayed in the guest room instead of commandeering my master suite. Danny found his own apartment and moved out entirely. Frank limited his visits to weekends and actually helped with household chores instead of treating my home like a hotel. It was better. Significantly better. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this transformation was motivated more by fear of losing their comfortable living situation than by genuine respect for my dignity and autonomy. The test came 6 weeks later, when I'd recovered enough to resume most of my normal activities but was still dealing with fatigue and occasional chest discomfort that reminded me of my mortality. I was sitting in my garden on a warm March afternoon, watching Emma sleep in her stroller while Rebecca worked on her laptop at the patio table, when she brought up a subject I'd been expecting her to raise eventually. I've been thinking about the future, she said, closing her laptop and giving me her full attention. About what would happen if something happened to you. Something happened to me. The euphemism people use when they don't want to say, when you die, directly. What kind of thinking? I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this conversation was headed. Well, Marcus would inherit the house, obviously, she said. But I'm wondering if there are things we should discuss beforehand. Financial planning, legal arrangements, that sort of thing. Financial planning and legal arrangements. She was fishing for information about my estate planning, trying to understand what would happen to her comfortable lifestyle if I died. I've taken care of all that, I said simply. Everything is properly documented and legally sound. That's good, she said, though I could hear the underlying frustration in her voice. I just want to make sure Marcus knows what to expect, so he can plan accordingly. Plan accordingly. For the windfall that would come when I was no longer around to complicate their lives with my presence. He'll know everything he needs to know when the time comes, I said, which was absolutely true, though not in the way she was hoping. That evening, I overheard a conversation between Marcus and Rebecca that confirmed my suspicions about the motivations behind her recent behavioral changes. I'd gone to bed early, claiming fatigue from my garden activities, but I was actually wide awake when they began talking in their bedroom down the hall. Their voices carried through the old house's thin walls, and while I wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, I couldn't help but hear their discussion. Did you get any information about the will? Marcus asked. She says everything is taken care of, Rebecca replied, but she wouldn't give me any details. I think we need to be more direct about asking. I can't just ask my mother how much money I'm going to inherit when she dies, Marcus said, though his tone suggested he was considering it. Why not? Rebecca said. It's a reasonable question. We need to know what we're working with for financial planning purposes. Financial planning purposes. They were already calculating how to spend money I hadn't died yet to leave them. What if she's changed the will? Rebecca continued. What if she's angry about everything that happened and decided to leave everything to charity or something? What if she's changed the will? The possibility had clearly occurred to her, which suggested she understood on some level that her treatment of me might have consequences. Mom wouldn't do that, Marcus said, but he didn't sound entirely convinced. She's not vindictive. I'm not saying she's vindictive, Rebecca said. I'm saying she might think we don't appreciate what we have. And maybe we haven't done the best job of showing appreciation. Maybe we haven't done the best job of showing appreciation. It was the closest thing to an admission of guilt I'd heard from either of them. The conversation continued for another hour, with them discussing various scenarios for my estate and debating strategies for ensuring they received what they considered to be their fair share. It was illuminating in the worst possible way, confirming that their recent kindness was motivated by inheritance anxiety rather than genuine remorse. The next morning, I called Richard Henley and asked him to meet me for lunch. How are you feeling? He asked when we settled into a quiet corner booth at a restaurant downtown. Physically, much better, I said. Emotionally, more resolved than ever about the choices I've made. I told him about Rebecca's fishing expedition regarding my estate plans, about the conversation I'd overheard between her and Marcus, about the way their treatment of me had improved only after they realized they might lose access to my financial resources. They're being nice to me because they're afraid I've changed my will, I said. Not because they've had a genuine change of heart about how they've treated me. Richard listened without commenting, occasionally nodding as I explained the recent developments in my household. What do you want to do? He asked when I finished. I want to make sure they understand exactly what they've earned, I said. I want them to know that their inheritance reflects their authentic treatment of me, not the performance they've been putting on since my heart attack. The will stands as written? The will stands exactly as written, I confirmed. But I want to add something to the letter. I want to explain that I was aware of their recent efforts to be kinder, and that those efforts don't change my assessment of their overall pattern of behavior. We spent the next hour crafting an addendum to the letter that would accompany my will, explaining that genuine respect and care couldn't be retroactively applied to erase months of manipulation and disregard. People often try to make amends when they realize there might be consequences for their actions, the addendum read. But authentic change requires sustained effort over time, not temporary adjustments motivated by self-interest. The inheritance you are receiving reflects your consistent pattern of behavior, not your recent attempts to modify that behavior for strategic purposes. It was harsh but fair, accurate but not cruel. They would understand that I'd seen through their performance, that I'd recognized their kindness as calculated rather than genuine. That afternoon, I returned home to find Rebecca in my kitchen preparing what looked like an elaborate dinner. She'd set my table with my good china, arranged flowers in my crystal vase, and was wearing the kind of dress she typically reserved for special occasions. What's the occasion? I asked, though I suspected this was another element of her campaign to demonstrate her newfound appreciation for my generosity. No special occasion, she said brightly. I just wanted to do something nice for you. You've been through so much with the heart attack and everything, and I want you to know how much we appreciate having you in our lives. Appreciate having you in our lives. The words felt rehearsed, like lines from a script she'd practiced to achieve maximum emotional impact. That's very thoughtful, I said, settling into my chair and noting that she'd prepared my favorite meal, roast chicken with herbs, mashed potatoes with real butter, and green beans cooked the way Harold used to make them. Marcus appeared from upstairs carrying Emma, both of them dressed more formally than usual. Even Emma was wearing a fancy dress with little pearl buttons that I recognized as an expensive outfit Rebecca had received as a baby gift. Doesn't this look wonderful, Mom? Marcus said, gesturing toward the elaborate table setting. Rebecca spent all afternoon preparing this. All afternoon preparing this. They were trying so hard to demonstrate their appreciation that it felt like a caricature of gratitude rather than the genuine article. Dinner was delicious, the conversation was pleasant, and they both made sustained efforts to include me in discussions about Emma's development, upcoming family events, and household decisions. It should have been enjoyable, but instead it felt like watching a performance of family harmony rather than experiencing the real thing. After dinner, Rebecca brought out a wrapped gift that she presented with the kind of ceremonial fanfare typically reserved for birthdays or holidays. This is just a little something to show you how much you mean to us, she said as I unwrapped what turned out to be a beautiful photo album filled with pictures of Emma's first weeks of life. The album was lovely, professionally made with high-quality paper and careful attention to detail. Every photo showed Emma in various stages of infant adorableness, with captions written in Rebecca's careful handwriting describing milestones and memorable moments. This is beautiful, I said, flipping through pages of images that captured Emma's earliest days. Thank you. I wanted you to have something special, Rebecca said, something that shows how important you are to Emma's life. Important to Emma's life. It was a lovely sentiment, and I was genuinely touched by the effort she'd put into creating the album. But I couldn't ignore the timing of this gesture, coming so soon after her fishing expedition about my estate plans. There's something else, Marcus said, exchanging a look with Rebecca that suggested they'd planned this entire evening carefully. We've been talking about Emma's future, about her education and the kind of opportunities we want to provide for her. Emma's future. I sensed we were approaching the real purpose of this elaborate dinner. We know you've always valued education, Rebecca continued, and we were wondering if you'd consider helping us set up a college fund for Emma. Something that would ensure she has the best possible start in life. A college fund for Emma. They wanted me to establish financial provisions for my granddaughter, which would be a lovely idea if I hadn't already done exactly that through the trust fund they knew nothing about. That's something we could certainly discuss, I said carefully, but Emma is still very young. We have plenty of time to think about her educational needs. Of course, Marcus said quickly, but we thought it might be good to start planning early. Maybe something that would be part of your overall estate planning. Part of your overall estate planning. There it was, the real agenda behind this evening's performance. They wanted me to revise my will to include specific provisions for Emma's education, which would presumably come out of Marcus's inheritance and reduce the amount available for charitable donations. I'll give it some thought, I said, which was true, though my thoughts would focus on how transparent their manipulation had become rather than on actual changes to my estate planning. The evening ended with extended hugs and expressions of gratitude, with promises to have more family dinners like this one, with assurances that they were committed to making our household a loving and respectful environment for everyone. It was all very touching, very sincere sounding, very carefully orchestrated to demonstrate their worthiness as beneficiaries of my estate. But it felt hollow, like watching actors perform emotions they didn't actually feel. That night, I lay in my bed listening to the familiar sounds of my house settling around me, thinking about performance and authenticity, about the difference between strategic kindness and genuine care. They were trying so hard to prove they deserved my money that they'd forgotten to prove they deserved my respect. They were so focused on securing their financial future that they'd lost sight of the fact that relationships can't be repaired through elaborate dinners and thoughtful gifts alone. The trust fund for Emma was already established, ensuring her educational future regardless of how her parents managed their inheritance. The will was final, reflecting their authentic treatment of me rather than their recent attempts at damage control. The letter explaining my reasoning was complete, connecting their inheritance to their behavior in terms they couldn't misunderstand or rationalize away. I felt peaceful about all of it, not because I was eager for them to face the consequences of their choices, but because I'd finally stopped allowing other people's expectations to override my own sense of justice and proportionality. They would inherit exactly what their behavior had earned, leftovers. Not because I was vindictive, but because that's what they'd shown me they believed I was worth. And Emma would inherit something much more valuable, the knowledge that her grandmother had loved her enough to ensure her independence, regardless of the family dynamics she'd been born into. The performance continued for several more weeks, with elaborate gestures of appreciation and carefully orchestrated demonstrations of family harmony. But I'd stopped being moved by it, stopped hoping it might represent genuine change. Instead, I focused on enjoying my time with Emma, on recovering my strength after the heart attack, on tending my garden as spring gradually transformed the landscape around my house. I was ready for whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that I'd made the right choices for the right reasons. Justice would be served, measured out in precisely the same proportions as the respect I'd been shown. Sometimes the best legacy you can leave is the lesson that actions have consequences, that treating people poorly will eventually cost you more than you ever imagined possible. The leftovers were prepared and waiting to be served. All that remained was for the dinner bell to ring. The end came peacefully on a Sunday morning in late September, exactly 8 months after Emma's birth. I was sitting in my garden with my granddaughter on my lap, pointing out the changing colors of the maple leaves and telling her about the seasons her grandfather and I had watched together in the same spot. Emma was babbling and reaching for the red leaves that drifted down around us, her chubby fingers grasping at the autumn air with the determined focus that 8-month-old babies bring to everything they encounter. She was beautiful, intelligent, and completely unaware that this would be our last morning together. I felt it happening gradually, a gentle slowing down that reminded me of a music box winding down to its final notes. There was no pain this time, no dramatic collapse or frantic calls for ambulances. Just a quiet settling, like falling asleep in my favorite chair while holding the person I loved most in the world. Marcus found us there an hour later when he came looking for Emma's morning snack. He said later that we looked peaceful, like we were both just napping in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the maple branches. The funeral was lovely, held in the same church where Harold and I had been married 43 years earlier. Rebecca had outdone herself with the arrangements, choosing flowers I would have loved and music that captured the life I'd lived rather than the death I'd died. She delivered a eulogy that painted me as the perfect mother-in-law and grandmother, full of praise for my generosity and wisdom and love. It was a beautiful performance, and I think she almost believed it herself. The will reading took place 3 days later in Richard Henley's office, with Marcus and Rebecca sitting across from his desk wearing the somber expressions people adopt when they're trying to look appropriately grief-stricken while secretly anticipating life-changing financial news. Richard began with the standard legal language, explaining the process and confirming everyone's identity before moving on to the actual provisions of the will. I could imagine Marcus and Rebecca exchanging glances as he read through the opening paragraphs, probably wondering when he would get to the part about the house and the financial accounts. To the Mercy General Hospital Foundation, Richard read, where I spent 37 years serving patients and families in their most vulnerable moments, I leave the sum of $200,000 to establish a continuing education fund for nursing staff. $200,000. I could picture Rebecca's face beginning to show the first signs of confusion as she tried to calculate how much would be left after such a substantial charitable donation. To the Riverside Food Bank, Richard continued, where I volunteered for over a decade and learned firsthand about the dignity of service without judgment, I leave the sum of $150,000 to support their meal programs for families in need. $150,000. Marcus was probably starting to do math at this point, subtracting charitable donations from the estate total he'd been assuming would come to him. To the scholarship fund at Riverside Community College, Richard read on, I leave the sum of $100,000 to support nursing students who demonstrate both academic excellence and financial need. $100,000. The donations were adding up to serious money that wouldn't be available for house payments and luxury purchases and the comfortable lifestyle Marcus and Rebecca had been planning. Richard continued through several smaller charitable bequests, each one representing an organization or cause that had actually mattered to me during my lifetime, each one reducing the amount that would be available for the people who'd treated my contributions to their lives as leftovers. Finally, he reached the personal bequests. To my beloved granddaughter, Emma Grace Williams, he read, I leave a trust fund in the amount of $300,000, to be managed by First National Bank and made available to her at age 18 for educational expenses and early independence. $300,000 for Emma. I could imagine the shock on Marcus and Rebecca's faces as they realized that their infant daughter had just inherited more money than they were likely to receive. The remainder of my estate, Richard continued, including my house, personal belongings, and remaining financial assets, I leave to my son Marcus Williams. The remainder. After all the charitable donations and Emma's trust fund, the remainder amounted to approximately $47,000 and a house with a substantial mortgage that Marcus would now be responsible for paying. But Richard wasn't finished yet. Mrs. Williams has also left a letter to be read in conjunction with this will, he said, opening the sealed envelope I'd prepared months earlier. She requested that this letter be read aloud to ensure that her intentions are clearly understood. I could imagine the silence in that room as Richard unfolded my letter and began to read my final words to the family I'd loved and lost. To my dear family, the letter began, I want you to understand that the distribution of my estate reflects the same proportion of care and consideration that you showed me during the final years of my life. Richard's voice remained professionally neutral as he read my explanation of their inheritance, but I knew the words were landing with devastating accuracy. For months, I was served leftover food while you enjoyed fresh meals prepared with my money in my house. I was pressured to relocate so you could have my home without my presence. I was treated as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected. The letter went on to detail specific instances of their behavior, connecting each example to their inheritance in terms they couldn't misunderstand or rationalize away. Marcus, you will inherit what remains after I have properly honored the organizations and causes that actually valued my contributions. This inheritance reflects the same attention to my well-being that you demonstrated throughout your marriage. To Rebecca. I'd been particularly careful with the language regarding Rebecca, knowing that anything too harsh might be dismissed as vindictive rather than educational. Rebecca, you receive nothing directly from my estate because you gave me nothing authentic during our relationship. Every kindness was strategic, every gesture of respect was calculated, and every expression of care was motivated by self-interest rather than genuine affection. The letter continued for several more paragraphs, explaining my reasoning with the same careful attention to detail that I'd applied to my nursing career. I wanted them to understand not just what they were receiving, but why they were receiving it. Emma will inherit substantially more than either of her parents because she was the only member of this family who loved me without conditions, who brought me joy without expecting anything in return, and who will have the opportunity to learn from your mistakes rather than repeat them. I'd ended the letter with words I hoped would stay with them long after the immediate shock of their reduced inheritance had faded. The greatest tragedy of our relationship is not that you treated me poorly, but that you never discovered how much I might have given you if you had simply treated me well. Generosity flows naturally from genuine love, but it withers under manipulation and dies under exploitation. Richard finished reading and set the letter aside, returning to the legal documents to wrap up the formal proceedings. The room remained silent except for the sound of Rebecca crying, though whether from grief or disappointment I would never know. Marcus inherited a house with mortgage payments he couldn't afford on his current salary, $47,000 that would barely cover moving expenses and debt consolidation, and the knowledge that his mother had seen through every manipulation his wife had orchestrated. Rebecca inherited nothing except the understanding that authentic relationships require authentic investment, and that strategic kindness is ultimately indistinguishable from sophisticated selfishness. Emma inherited financial independence and a legacy that would teach her the difference between love that seeks to control and love that seeks to liberate. The charities inherited resources that would continue my work of serving others long after I was gone, ensuring that my money would continue to flow toward people who understood the difference between gratitude and exploitation. Within 6 months, Marcus and Rebecca were forced to sell my house to pay the mortgage and settle their debts. They moved into a small apartment across town, their comfortable lifestyle replaced by the reality of living within their actual means rather than mine. Rebecca returned to work full-time, leaving Emma in daycare while she tried to rebuild the financial security she'd lost through her own miscalculations. Marcus took a second job to help cover their expenses, finally understanding what it meant to work for everything you have rather than inheriting comfort you hadn't earned. But the most important inheritance wasn't financial at all. Emma grew up with the knowledge that her grandmother had loved her enough to ensure her independence, regardless of the family dynamics she'd been born into. When she turned 18, she would have choices her parents never had, opportunities that couldn't be taken away by other people's poor decisions. The trust fund came with one condition: Emma had to read my letter and understand the circumstances that had led to her inheritance. She would learn about dignity and self-respect, about the importance of treating people well not because of what they might give you, but because of who you choose to be. Sometimes the most valuable legacy isn't money at all, but the lesson that actions have consequences, that treating people poorly will eventually cost you more than you ever imagined, and that genuine love creates abundance while manipulation breeds scarcity. I'd serve them exactly what they'd served me, leftovers. Not out of spite, but out of a desire to teach them the true value of what they'd been taking for granted. And, in the end, perhaps they learned something about appreciation, about the difference between earning respect and expecting it, about the kind of family they might have been if they'd chosen love over manipulation from the beginning. The garden they'd wanted to inherit along with my house was being tended by strangers now, people who would never know that every flower had been planted by hands that understood the difference between nurturing and neglecting, between growing something beautiful and simply taking what others had grown. But Emma would know. When she was old enough to understand, she would read my letter and learn about the grandmother who had loved her enough to ensure her future, regardless of the cost to everyone else. And maybe, if I'd done my job right, she would understand that the greatest gift you can give someone isn't money or property or comfort, but the knowledge that they are valued for who they are rather than what they can provide. The leftovers had been served, measured out in precisely the same proportions as the respect I'd been shown. Justice had been done, not through revenge, but through the simple mathematics of receiving exactly what you give. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.